Somebody once said, what did posterity ever do for me? Um, look, it's torture. 15 minutes for a verbal professor like me is torture. So I had to actually make some very hard decisions. And what I'm going to talk about, by the way, just pay no attention to this title. I gave a similar talk with similar slides at NYU recently, but there's a lot of new stuff in here. So I decided to focus on what have I been doing lately, and why have I been doing it? And because, well, the reason I've been doing it is because I think these are the most important problems that I can work on while I'm still on the planet. I'm very happy to be on the planet. I just want to make a sort of brief for me, comment on Jay's presentation. I love this integrated assessment stuff that his group has been building up. It's almost as if this thing is becoming a living, breathing organism that interacts. But to me, the most interesting thing is that there are these 4 different scenarios. People want to know what the future is. They went to the Oracle at Delphi for that reason. And if you look at these, they're all characterized, the RCPs, by the amount of radiative forcing that is sort of a steady state they get to at the end. Of all of these, the only one that is of real interest, at least to me, because I'm interested in the sustainability of our civilization, is what's called the 2.6 scenario, because that's the one that stabilizes around 2 degrees global warming. Very hard to attain, and I'm not at all sure we're going to be able to do it. But it's important to be able to think about what it would take to get there. I have a couple of pictures on the title slide that are interesting. First of all, human psychology, particularly evolutionary biology. You might recognize that from the scene at the Waterhole in 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's the tribalism of humankind that's in our genes, in my opinion, that makes it very hard to come to a consensus on collective action. There's also the recentness of some of the regional climate changes. This is Hurricane Sandy on its way to smack into New York, which had enormous implications for me personally and people in my family. And finally, as you see Earth with a satellite above it, and a long-term interest of mine, which I will not talk about further at this meeting, has been what kind of a power system might we have on a steady state planet to minimize radiative forcing from greenhouse gases. Solar is what I've been working on recently, and I'll show you some concrete examples of that. But if we could collect the solar energy in orbit above the Earth and somehow beam it to the Earth's surface, this is an old idea, but we've been interested in doing it with lasers rather than microwaves, because you can focus the beam and actually project a laser beam on an existing array of photovoltaic cells onto the surface of the Earth, and you can do that 24 hours a day, and you can increase the output of solar farms, for example, by very large factors of almost 10 by doing that. And so it's one particular evolutionary path. Again, I'm not going to go into that unless someone asks me a question. This is what I will go into. My wife and I recently, I'm professor emeritus at NYU, so she's been wanting to move to Florida forever, and I've been resisting it. My whole head couldn't accept it. Everyone's brain dead in Florida. I'll sit in my room and I'll look at the internet and I'll write emails to my friends, and I won't have anything to do. And then, I won't go into the details. I actually took a bad fall in Manhattan, and I thought, you know, New York City's trying to kill me. And I decided that why don't we move to Florida and build a solar house and photovoltaic and test the hypothesis that we could have a zero carbon footprint. This is a question that interested me for a long time, but even though I read a lot of journals on solar energy and solar power, I never got an answer to that particular question because guys in universities don't necessarily write papers on that topic. And so we built the solar house. It's got 49 solar panels. I'll show you a picture of what it looks like. And I couldn't even get software to do this. So we have some software that measures our daily production of electricity. These are kilowatt hour electric. Kilowatt hour electric, that's that little E after the W, per day. This is since we've been there longer, but since we've been taking the data, which is about 4.5 or 5 months. And that's, I won't go into how we got this. I had to create a spreadsheet, and my wife enters numbers into it. Forget all of that. It's right. We checked it. The red curve is the production in kilowatt hours electrical per day since we set this system up. It starts just after March. And the blue curve is our usage. Now the usage is all the electricity that we use to air condition the house. It includes Iris's solar hybrid car, which is just a Ford C-Max plug-in hybrid. It includes something that I ride around in, which is called an Elf. I'll show you a picture of it. It's a recumbent bicycle with electric assist, solar powered. And if you look carefully, you'll see the red lines are bigger, are higher than the blue lines almost every day. There might be maybe 2% or so when we're negative. And what happens to the difference is called net metering. We sell the difference, the excess to Duke Energy, and we have to buy it back from Duke Energy at night because we like to turn on the lights at night sometimes, and the sun is not shining. So this net metering is the effective storage that we use. And it is the 500-pound gorilla, in my opinion, in actually having almost everybody in this country become solar neutral, because I think that you can see it right off the picture. As far as residential electricity and automotive use, we're basically there. And it's also cost effective, but I'll answer those questions later if anyone has them. Now, there's been a kind of psychological depression that has set in my brain with the current Congress. I won't go into the details of this, but you guys know what I'm talking about. It's totally dysfunctional. And one party, which I won't mention which party it is, actually doesn't believe in science, doesn't believe in some of the canonical findings of science. And so all of the ideas that many of us had, that the federal government would implement a program to develop alternative energy sources that would be an approach to reducing CO2 emissions, are simply not going to happen in the near or immediate future. At least the United States is not going to lead that. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with, although I haven't heard anyone say it, the breakdown of the Framework or Climate Convention to limit CO2 emissions. Most of you probably know that globally CO2 emissions have been increasing at breakneck speeds, although the U.S. component has come down mainly because of natural gas and the Great Recession. However, all of this stuff that we were writing about, I had often wondered, does anyone in the West Wing ever pay attention to this? Or is this going into a black hole somewhere? And recently, Tom Friedman interviewed Obama on a program I think was called The Year of Living Dangerously on Showtime. And one of the things Obama says here, we've been dying to hear him say it, is, and I don't know how many people know he said it, science is science, he says. And there's no doubt that if we burned all the fossil fuel that's in the ground right now, that the planet's going to get too hot and the consequences could be dire. And then Friedman asks him, so we can't burn it all? we're not going to be able to burn it all. Over the course of the next several decades, we're going to have to build a ramp from how we currently use energy to where we need to use energy. And we're not going to suddenly turn a switch and suddenly we're no longer using fossil fuels. But we have to use this time wisely so that you have a tapering off of fossil fuels, replaced by clean energy sources that are not releasing carbon. But I very much believe in keeping that 2-degree Celsius target as a goal. Where's Jay? That's the 2.6 case. So the federal government, the guy who is nominally at least the president of this country, has said that he subscribes to that scenario. Well, I mean, given the Congress, I don't know what that means. And so earlier, before Obama was president, I had written an op-ed to Nature and in a vain hope, where I said, open your minds to civilization powered by wind turbines in harmony with our landscape and continental shelves, solar electricity from deserts, and Earth orbit powering our cities, safe and proliferation-resistant nuclear reactors, coal gasifiers, I threw everything in, coal gasifiers driving efficient electric power plants with CO2 stored underground, along with energy-efficient homes and public buildings, smart power grids, high-speed rail, electric and biofuel cars, even carbon-neutral fuels made from sunlight, water, and CO2 in the atmosphere more efficiently than nature does by photosynthesis. Say it, Barack. Shout it from the rooftops. Dedicate your presidency to it, and you will stand immortal in the pantheon of American leaders who changed everything. Dream on, of course. And so this was published as a worldview. I would bet if we took a poll, many of you would agree with this as a goal. But of course, it didn't happen. And I'm not going to go over any of this in detail, but this was in the New York Times, and it basically shows the path that we have to go through in emissions, this declining ramp. This is this off ramp. So over the next 50 years, carbon emissions would basically have to be phased out. And we can look at the electricity sources, the coal, the natural gas, the nukes. Incidentally, I'm a fellow at a place called the Breakthrough Institute in Oakland, which I have a lot of disagreements with, the biggest one of which is the fact that natural gas should be supported by the environmental community because it's a good bridge to the future, and I'm not sure that the Koch brothers are pushing it because it's going to be a bridge. I think they want it to be something like the pyramids that will last forever, which of course it won't. But this is a study that was done by actually one of my former students, and Nathan Myhrvold, who some of you may know was the chief technology officer of Microsoft, the evil empire of Microsoft. And it compares for the 100-year warming for 1 terawatt energy production for existing technologies. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but basically it shows that natural gas is not that much better than coal, marginally, but that if you're really serious, you've got to go to nukes, you've got to go to solar or wind. And I knew this wouldn't be enough. All right, look. This was 1979. This is actually me on the roof of our NYU Barney building. You can see photovoltaic cells. We had built a wind turbine, which, as John knows, it was actually partly funded by John Denver. And I think John may have even been involved in funding us for this. And this is Jane Pauley. We were both a lot younger then. This was interviewing me for the Today Show, because it was in '79, my God, it was a different geologic era when the energy crisis was perceived. to be really important. The more things change, well, this is a cover of the New Yorker a couple of months ago, which basically shows the same stuff that was on the roof of the Barney building, the NYU Barney building, wind turbines and photovoltaic cells. This is Sandy. This is, I found very disturbing and yet very inspiring at the same time. Inspired me enough to actually push my granddaughter to study evolutionary psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's still an undergraduate, but she's working in the evolutionary psychology lab because she's got a domineering grandfather who's crazy enough to push her into it. Seeming public apathy. This was in Nature Climate Change. Many of you may have seen this. Seeming public apathy over climate change is often attributed to a deficit in comprehension. Susan Hassel will tell us about why this is true. The public knows too little science, it is claimed, to understand the evidence or avoid being misled. Widespread limits on technical reasoning aggravate the problem by forcing citizens to use unreliable cognitive heuristics to assess risk. They have a great way of expressing themselves. We conducted a study to test this account and found no support for it. Members of the public with the highest degrees of science literacy and technical reasoning capacity were not the most concerned about climate change. Rather, they were the ones among whom cultural polarization was greatest. This result suggests that public divisions over climate change stem not from the public's incomprehension of science, but from a distinctive conflict of interest. We can go into this more. I want to just show you a few things. This is my house. This is with the solar panels going up. While, before they cart me away, I really want to try to do something good. And this is my garage. This is Iris's Ford C-Max. This is my recumbent bicycle. That's a spec sheet for my solar panels. This is the output. This is what I can read the output of my solar panels. I was looking at it online earlier today. Here's this, and these are my takeaway. Please let me just do that.
Sure.
Okay, only 4 things. A down ramp to near zero emissions, 50 to 100 years hence, might still keep global warming below 2 degrees C and mitigate some of the scariest irreversible climatic impacts. I said might. Coal must go. Jim Hansen certainly knows that. Fracked shale gas may be in transition. Not by me, but to some. Sustainable futures are solar, wind, maybe nukes. Solar and wind are the most ready, as are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and ELF-like vehicles, which are basically bicycles assisted by solar. Deep storage isn't. So prioritize innovative storage, which is the key to solar and wind baseload, as net metering by utility grids saturates at a certain point. Finally, and this is just my own personal message, think globally, act locally. If you may not be able to change the world, but you might be able to change yourself. And that's what I've been trying to do. Science literacy, logic, and imagination all count. But policy has to account for this naked apes that we are, our evolutionary psychology, in collective energy climate problem solving. And I think those are all worth thinking about. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. Any other questions?
No.
Actually, I had a question. So I'm sure you get asked all the time,
Yeah.
what about China?
China is a wonderful country. What about China? Well, China is extraordinarily instructive. As everyone knows, China has taken over as being the largest emitter of CO2. Basically, it isn't only, China is the exemplar, but it isn't only China. It's China, it's India, it's Indonesia. We're living in this globalized world where you have post-industrial countries, which is what we are. We haven't come to terms with that politically yet, because many of the problems that we have with unemployment and all of that are really due to the fact that we don't make things anymore. And then we have industrial countries like China, which we cannot compete with in terms of labor. And these are the countries that make everything. In terms of research and modeling, you have to take into account, when you're trying to figure out everybody's footprint, that our footprint, even for our own house, does not include the CO2 that was emitted in China to make the stuff that we eventually buy here. I would bring this back to an earlier question that I asked. I think we may not be asking the right question. I think the question that we should be asking, is it possible to keep our high-tech, human-created civilization and live that way sustainably on the Earth? I tried to answer that question partly when we moved down to Florida and see if we could at least do it for our residential consumption. I think the answer is yes, but I don't think we can do it with 7 billion people on the Earth. If you try to do it with equity, so that all the aspirations of countries like China, who are poorer than us, are that we would reach a common level of, wealth or gratification through material things, then the per capita consumption of things and our per capita impact on the ecosystem of the world would not survive, even if we just kept our 7 billion population. So I think we have to decrease the population of the world. I don't think it's impossible. China's a good example. China, because it's a dictatorship, was able to say 1 child per family or you're dead, or whatever they said. And they were able to limit the growth of their population. Part of the problem, a lot of people are going to get very angry at me in the room, is economics, the discipline of economics. As far as I know, with very few exceptions, like a guy Daly, an economist who's a sustainable economist, all economists, whether they're Marxist or rampant capitalists, believe in economic growth. And if you're going to have continued economic growth exponentially, even in the lowest rate of exponential growth, is eventually going to blow up. Every physicist in the world knows that. I wish every economist in the world knew that. And that's the problem that we're having, I think.